This is an ODB Films production. Visit odbfilms.com today.
In Latin, Renovo means to renew, restore, or revive. This show is all about growing in our understanding and practice of faith. Past episodes are available wherever you like to listen to podcasts. I'm Doug Tuke, the Director of Ministry at ODB Films, and today we look at one of my favorite theologians in the 20th century. Not even just favorite theologians, like favorite, most inspiring people ever, who was very famous in the 20th century, but whose influence has only continued to grow and really change hearts and understand what it means to be a Christian. I am talking about no one other than Dietrich Bonhoeffer, pastor, preacher, spy, and martyr of the Christian faith. Amazing guy. Eric Metaxas, really great writer. He kind of wrote the exhaustive biography of Bonhoeffer. That's a great read. It's also available on audio. It's fantastic, and you should all read it. But all of us at ODB Films have really been steeped in reading up on Bonhoeffer lately, and so I was strongly inspired to do a show and to try to get it into our time limit, which I'll do the best we can. But man alive, I got to tell you, please, please, please let your heart just sink into the great writings of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and hopefully let his story just inspire you to grow in the faith. And without further ado, here's what it is. So on the 4th of February, 6 years after the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, the Bonhoeffers had twins in Breslau, Germany. And his dad, Dietrich Bonhoeffer's dad, a very established neurologist, added a daughter and a son that they later named Dietrich, and the former Sabine, that was his twin sister. And eventually, actually, Dietrich would have 8 siblings. After a little bit of schooling in Tübingen, Dietrich attended for 3 years the University of Berlin, starting in 1924. And then finally, after he wrote his dissertation, Sanctorum Communio, the 21-year-old earned his doctorate with honors. And he went to Barcelona in 1929 for a year as a curator and a student pastor for the German congregation in Spain. Just like national churches in the U.S. have brought, their own kind of foreign pastors to pastor churches, there was a German church in Spain, so they kind of brought him to be the German pastor. His travels in Europe included a Roman adventure as well. He had a great deal of, he was heavily influenced by his experience of Catholic churches in Rome. Eric Metaxas writes about that exhaustively in his biography and talks about just the beauty of the stained glass, the cathedral, the basilicas, all these incredible things. And then he was accepted to teach at the University of Berlin in 1930 after finishing his qualifying thesis, which is called Act and Being. Amazing stuff. So August of 1930 started a year when he did postgraduate work at Union Theological Seminary in New York. The reason that I am aware of Bonhoeffer and aware of all of his great teaching is because the chair of the theology department in my little local undergrad, Carroll College, Dr. John Hart, also received his doctorate from Union Theological Seminary alongside of Gustavo Gutierrez and a lot of other famous folks. So he came from Union until he returned to his post lecturing at his alma mater in 1931. So he was at Union in 1930, 1931 he goes back. But while in New York, he did a lot of work at the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem, right in the middle of Harlem Renaissance. Amazing stuff. He also traveled to Mexico and Cuba. In his day, Bonhoeffer, despite how young he was, he could pretty much more than ably communicate amazing theological details, the intricacies and sophisticated ideas out of kind of German and English theology. He really had a profound mind. He fell in love with American jazz, fell in love with American Baptist gospel singing as this authentic expression of faith. Just incredible stuff. Dietrich Bonhoeffer became Pastor Bonhoeffer in an official ordination at St. Matthias Church in Berlin in November of 1931. Now, Nazi propaganda really began claiming that they were bringing moral and spiritual renewal to Germany and ultimately Europe and beyond at this time. And this did not penetrate Bonhoeffer's resolve or his discernment to be a pastor at all. In fact, Bonhoeffer published his winter semester of 31 to 32 lectures called Creation and Fall right about that time. Now, events of 1933, namely the election by one vote of Adolf Hitler, Chancellor of Germany, prompted his continued criticism of National Socialism's Aryanism and it's just basic hatred of everything else, especially the Jews. So Bonhoeffer, he belonged to a group that openly rebuted the pro-Nazi German Christians. By April of that year, he wrote that civil disobedience was correct when opposing unrighteous political movements. Started to make a really bold statement at a young age as his fame as a real presence in the church started to grow. So before he began to pastor at the Sydenheim German Evangelical Church, he helped organize the Pastors Emergency League. And in September 1933, so that year, he started to question really Christians like avoiding sin when obsessed with questionable politics. Wow, how relevant is that today? Do we let our politics inform our faith, or does our faith inform our politics? Good stuff. So he authored the Bethel Confession, his belief in this the kind of planet-wide brotherhood of the body of Christ, that it needed forgiveness and responsibility, to take responsibility. It was a really bold statement. He befriended the prominent George Bell, bishop in the Anglican Church, while he assumed a pastorate at London's Reformed Church of St. Paul. So he was really mingling with some of the big church authorities of the time. In 1934, he became a member of Bishop Bell's Universal Christian Council for Life and Work. If you hear me say UCCLW, that's what it is. It's Bishop Bell's Universal Council. Okay. So lots of things were happening in 1933, and there were just a lot of signs that year. It just proved to be a really evil year. By April, Hitler's first official act was to order a day's boycott of Jewish businesses. So factories and stores witnessed the pickets, but Dietrich's grandmother, Julie Bonhoeffer, she's just a brave, amazing woman. She marched right past the SS stormtroopers and bought some strawberries in one of the Jewish department stores that she frequented. And there's actually some witness of this. An American visitor that was there witnessed it and said they didn't dare take this elderly woman. She was very alert and walked elegantly, so nobody was going to stop her. I love that, because you know that his grandmother, that Julie really influenced kind of Dietrich's resolve, which is great. The next step by Hitler was the removal and the banning of Jews in public office and even church posts, Christian or not. So even though at this time, until 1935, Bonhoeffer was still pastoring in England, he kept in touch with the opposition, who would become what becomes called the Confessing Church, which included Karl Barth, one of the most famous 20th century theologians, an amazing kind of the author of Neo-Orthodoxy, okay? And the church was led by Martin Niemöller. The Confessing Church would involve about a third of Germany's Protestant leaders. Also, theologically, Karl Barth's Neo-Orthodoxy would pretty much influence Bonhoeffer throughout his entire career. So this is where all of those great minds, their paths really started to cross, not just socially, but theologically, okay? Now, as a member of the UCCLW, he tours Europe, and he tried to put those of kind of this ecumenical movement on a much-needed guilt trip in behalf of the beleaguered Confessing Church, being maybe the only ones with actual orthodoxy and pacifism. Remember, orthodoxy doesn't mean right-wing, it means right teaching. So they were very convicted by the fact that Christianity demanded civil disobedience, but it also demanded love for your brothers and sisters, namely the Jews, okay? So the Confessing Church was born in Barmen, Germany in May 1934. The Barmen Declaration of 1934 officially made complaint against the incursion of Nazism in the German church. Now, August of 1934, Bonhoeffer preached a dynamic message, okay, convincing all these attendees to denounce the church, the state affiliation with fascism, and really promote peace at a youth conference in Fano, Denmark. And I should take a minute just to say what's known about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and trust me, this is my passion, so I could spend the whole time talking about this, but I'm really tempering myself to only bring it up once. He was considered an absolutely elegant, dynamic, charismatic youth minister. He was a heart-changing youth minister. In fact, very seriously considered staying in youth ministry as a career, but then he found himself kind of falling back into academia and becoming this great pastor. I love that because I'm a youth minister. I love that his heart burned to serve young people, and that really the roots of a lot of the Confessing Church and its movement was in youth conference. How great is that? Okay, because the Nazis took over all the theological seminaries, In April of 1935, in Zingst on the Baltic Sea, it became the new home for the underground preachers' seminary for the Confessing Church until June, when Finkenwald, Pomerania, provided the final resting place, the haven for this thing, okay? Now, it was here that the confessing community was emphasized in his teaching. So this coincides with the time that Bonhoeffer returned to Germany in the spring from Great Britain. This group eventually seemed to Dietrich to lean too much in an overly apolitical, more militant, and especially without like an overabundance of a neutral outlook toward the Jews' persecutions. But he stayed involved with them to 1939. Now, inspired by these heady days, he wrote Spiritual Care and other pastoral ministry pieces, and his two most famous books, The Cost of Discipleship, 1937, and Life Together, 1938. On August 5th, 1936, the professor was no longer welcome to teach at the University of Berlin, and things started to really escalate, all right? The Gestapo raided Finkenwald Seminary in 1937, arresting 27 people. Now, Bonhoeffer devised, quote-unquote, collective pastorates, where those learning the ministry hooked up with like individual underground pastors, and he met with them for classes, like one-on-one. And he was really kind of rethinking his Gandhi-like pacifism, seeing patriotism in treason, all right? That's a great way to kind of think about where he was coming from theologically. Now, in February of the next year, Bonhoeffer was introduced to the resistance circle by his brother-in-law, Hans von Donau. There's lots of ways to say that. Dohnanyl. I'm going to go with that because I know I can't pronounce it in German. Now, this conspiracy of political and military overthrow of Hitler and the Nazi regime was kind of aborted with the Munich Agreement later on. Okay, there's a lot going on here. I don't want you to get lost. Understand this. Dietrich was thrust into being really the dean of the Finkenwald Seminary, and he poured his heart into it. And he brought contemplative prayer practices to these seminarians that they were just completely unfamiliar with, and a lot of whom journaled about and just couldn't stand. Like they were like, what the heck are we doing? Why are we meditating on scripture? Let's study. Let's be great preachers. So he really was blending this almost monastic approach to what was considered a Protestant seminary, bringing all kinds of brilliant ideas together to create really a newness in the church. Amazing stuff. He got discouraged at times. He was obviously heavily influential at times. The most important thing to recognize here is this, that he really fell in love with notions of mentorship and teaching, which stuck with him the rest of his life, okay? Now, around all this time, he wrote his Ethics, and that was a big volume, okay? And he says this in his Ethics. He says, "There is now no law behind which the responsible man can seek cover." Now, listen, Bonhoeffer expected believers to serve Jesus Christ with absolute moral responsibility, guided by obedience to his ways, Christ's ways, even to the point of civil legal disregard. It was a very strong, convicted teaching of righteousness, okay? Now, on the 2nd of June, 1939, Bonhoeffer went back to New York's Union Theological Seminary to teach. But the threats of war only caused this man with this great heart from God for his people to return to Germany and the resistance on July 27th of that year. So from June to July, it was very quick, right? And he says this is kind of his prophetic rationale, okay? Straight from the mouth of Bonhoeffer, he says, I quote, "I have had time to think and to pray about my situation and that of my nation, and to have God's will for me clarified. I have come to the conclusion I have made a mistake in coming to America. I shall have no right to participate in the reconstruction of the Christian life in Germany after the war if I did not share in the trials of this time with my people. Christians in Germany face the terrible alternative of willing the defeat of their nation in order that civilization may survive, or willing the victory of their nation and thereby destroying civilization. I know which of these alternatives I must choose, but I cannot make that choice in security." Wow. What a declaration, right? 1940 came, offered a lot more misery to Bonhoeffer's ministry when the police put a gag order on his preaching. By March of 1941, Bonhoeffer was not allowed to write, publish, or distribute anything, okay? In 1943, the 37-year-old Dietrich, who in January had just become engaged to Maria von Wedenmeyer, became involved in Operation 7, which was the smuggling of Jews out of Germany into neutral Switzerland. On April 5th of that year, Bonhoeffer did continue his ministry in Berlin's Tegel prison, joining his brother-in-law and sister Christine, where inmates and guards as witnesses told of his giving counsel and really just kind of, quite frankly, his counseling, like his soul nourishment. He was still allowed to see family and comrades, and he was still allowed to write, okay? How much did this parallel the Apostle Paul, right? Amazing stuff. So we have the opportunity to really kind of glimpse into Bonhoeffer's sort of intermittent experiences with correspondence, including love letters from his fiancée and a bunch of other things. And you would think that all this disappointment, all the struggles, all the gagging that he's received would have pretty much embittered him. But instead, he writes this. He says, "We in the resistance have learned to see the great events of world history from below, from the perspective of the excluded, the ill-treated, the powerless, the oppressed, and despised, so that personal suffering has become a more useful key for understanding the world than personal happiness." Wow, that's a great line for the 21st century, right? On July 20th, 1944, a suitcase bomb placed under the conference table by conspirators, including some of the group that he was involved with, it exploded, but it failed to kill Hitler. Initially, Bonhoeffer, who was actually moved on February 7th, 1945, to Buchenwald concentration camp, was not tied to them, but then the Gestapo found a diary in April that evidenced his connection. And then now, along with others, he was sent to Flossenburg, really the last place he was sent. Exactly 2 years after his first arrest, he was ordered to be annihilated by Hitler on the same day that his brother-in-law was killed at another camp, April 9th, 1945, at Flossenburg. He was stripped naked. Only 39 years of age, he knelt down for his last prayer before he was hung from the gallows. Wow. What a life, okay? He wrote a poem, 1946, it was published, Poem from Prison. It was published in 1946, titled "Who Am I?" And I want to read it to you because it unpacks just a lot of the truths of who Dietrich Bonhoeffer was. It goes like this. "Who am I? They often tell me. I step from my cell's confinement calmly, cheerfully, firmly, like a squire from his country house. Who am I? They often tell me. I used to speak to my warders freely and friendly and clearly, as though it were mine to command. Who am I? They also tell me. I bore the days of misfortune equally, smilingly, proudly, like one accustomed to win. Am I then really all that which other men tell of? Or am I only what I myself know of myself, restless and longing and sick, like a bird in a cage, struggling for breath as though hands were compressing my throat, yearning for colors, for flowers, for the voices of birds, thirsting for words of kindness, for neighborliness, tossing in expectation of great events, powerlessly trembling for friends at an infinite distance, weary and empty, at praying, at thinking, at making, faint and ready to say farewell to it all. Who am I? This or the other? Am I one person today and tomorrow another? Am I both at once? A hypocrite before others, and before myself, a contemptibly woebegone weakling? Or is something within me still like a beaten army, fleeing in disorder from victory already achieved? Who am I? They mock me, these lonely questions of mine. Whoever I am, thou knowest, O God. I am thine. What are you hearing in that? What do you hear there? What do you hear from him? No matter what he thinks he is, he knows he's God's. And that is really at the heart of what Bonhoeffer writes. He has such profound theology. I mean, some of his theological assertions concerning man's independence, even from God, were taken way liberally in the 60s. And these were somewhat misunderstood ideas like religionless Christianity. And unfortunately, they were not really more elaborated upon, more fully due to the premature death of this great Christian man. But the intellectual community is very aware of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's ethical writings, but they stem from an intense biblical perspective, specifically. That being separation of the church from the world. Whether you're a pacifist or resistant sympathizer, Bonhoeffer was consistent with his very strong feeling of the churches, not conforming to the popular worldview, but following the mind of Christ. And then also, obviously very popular, the notion of costly grace versus cheap grace. He was fighting the good fight against what is also called easy believism, specifically, that's taking advantage of God's ultimate forgiveness on the cross, and sometimes known as pietism or a holiness movement. It was never the answer to the problem of any kind of Calvinist teaching or once saved, always saved. The cavalier attitude that leads to sort of willful sinning is the opposite of what that true, unearned, undeserved sacrifice in our stead giving us freedom and power to live sanctified lives in costly grace. This is really the heart of what Bonhoeffer teaches us. There is a ton more to his story. There is so much more depth, so much more righteousness, relationships, men and women, his beautiful family, all of his childhood experiences that really dictate who he becomes as a man. And I encourage you to dig in to get to know him. But I have to tell you, for the sake of our limited time, open your heart to this man's teaching. The Cost of Discipleship is probably his most famous book, also just called Discipleship. It's easy to read, but it is probably one of the most challenging theological texts that you'll ever encounter, because quite frankly, it'll challenge you to look in the mirror and say, as a Christian man or woman, do I walk the talk? And is there another figure in the theological academic sphere and the social activism world that live that more truly than Dietrich Bonhoeffer? So celebrate him and get to know him. Thanks for listening. Sincerely, we are partners in the journey of faith. I hope you will share the Renovo podcast with friends and foes. Send your topic suggestions, questions, and or comments to doug@odbfilms.com. Always remember to engage the tradition and live the conversion. Until next time, God bless.